Okay, so I'm going to continue where I left off from yesterday. I went over all this stuff, and so now I'm just going to get straight into reviewing some of the videos that I said I was going to review from the beginning. So finally, I guess. We're going to start with one where they're reviewing the concept of white supremacy, right? So you'll see what I'm talking about when I get to it. Okay, and I want to start it here. This shouldn't be too long because I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I'll go back and forth off of this video as far as points that I feel like need to be addressed.
All of these processes or variations of white superiority stem from the phenomenon of material relationships between European descended people and black and brown people of the world. What I'm trying to say is that white supremacy, or the belief in the capacity of people who are descended from European backgrounds having some kind of ascended ability to function above black and brown people, is a direct consequence of the material accumulation of resources, power, weaponry, technology, wealth that has been given to elites of certain empires within European communities. And because they were able to have had technological advances as a result of contact with other empires, for example, the Andalusian Islamic Empire, for example, other empires, the Roman Empire, if you will, and having had certain advantages in their capacity to acquire wealth, to acquire resources and technology, it gave them an upper hand in interacting with communities that may not have had those civilizational advancements and generate a worldview where resource acquisition developed over time. And because they had certain dominion and control over that kind of weaponry, over that kind of land, over that type of seafaring transport through naval ships and so on and so forth, they accumulated wealth and resources. Since the economic paradigm that they normally engaged in was based in mercantilism, also eventually capitalism, through this period of what's called primitive accumulation, they started to generate large amounts of wealth that started to manifest in processes and economic vehicles like slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, gold extraction, wealth extraction, things of that nature that over time gave them advantages over not only geographic types of people, but also spaces of land in order to be able to extract wealth and resources from over time and send them to their metropoles. As a result of their capacity to send that wealth to their metropoles being their foreign centers of power, whether it be Paris or London, if you will, they were also able to develop centers of wealth accumulation where people who physically looked closer to them were able to benefit. However, let's not make this about quote unquote a racialization of this system. Even in this period of empire development, there were many people who were white or European descended who were not benefiting from these systems, particularly when these systems started to develop more industrially in terms of their economic mechanisms, in terms of how they actually started to develop labor. You would find that there were many whites who were suffering horrifically in terms of their ability to work, their ability, their quality of life, and their ability to survive in these same metropoles. So the notion that somehow, quote unquote, whiteness in and of itself was a key to being able to guarantee someone an assurance to be able to be elevated above black and brown people is a misnomer. One of the things that we have to understand, and it's very difficult for us to understand, is that whiteness is a product of the North American mechanisms of primitive accumulation. The first time we find any kind of documentation of the term or concept of whiteness is in the 1600s in the United States, in what would become the United States. It was not the United States at that time, in Virginia around the period of Bacon's rebellions, where we're actually seeing black people and poor whites trying to come together to fight to actually challenge elites at that time. So the need to create whiteness, as that really great book from Theodore Allen, The Creation of the White of Whiteness, I believe it's entitled, discusses how whiteness is created as a means to deny the capacity of poor and working class people from various different racial backgrounds, or there's only one race, it's a human race, physical, various physical descriptions, being able to come together and unite and come together and challenge the lords of capital.
Okay, we can stop it there. Okay, we'll start from the beginning, I guess, right? So, the first thing was, I mean, if you've been following what I've been saying for the last few videos, you will know about the material conditions thing, right? So, if you watch the videos on what's the problems with Marxism, we know that that's just made up. The material conditions, right? Obviously, if you look at actual conditions, they're material conditions, right? But material conditions don't just come by themselves. The ideological conditions aren't separate from those. Like you cannot separate these two things, right? So Marx decided he wanted to do that when historically the great philosophers that existed, like pretty much all the geniuses that we know, I mean, kind of theoretically had these things tied together, right? Going all the way back to Aristotle, going all the way back to Plato. I mean, people argued erroneously that there was this kind of separation, but there was just tightening down of the theoretical framework, right? I mean, the same thing applies to Descartes versus Spinoza, right? They they argued there was no mind body problem. Descartes wasn't dumb. I mean, he was coming up with analytic geometry and the precursors to calculus at the same time that he was doing all this other type of stuff, right? He was a genius. He knew what he was talking about. Spinoza just tightened up the theory, philosophically a lot more, right? Because he was able to go advance off what Descartes was saying and expand to the logical conclusions that maybe Descartes didn't mention, right? So we already know that the material thing versus the ideological thing is just a complete, it's crazy. It doesn't, it's not formulated toward how human beings actually experience the world, first of all, and then it doesn't differentiate between what is ideological and what constitutes not being ideological, right? So, for example, ask the question, right? Did they even have to invade Africa and get slaves and build out wealth, right? Because you could argue from the laws of capitalism, right, that they needed to do this and to do that. Which you can't argue with is asking the question, well, did they need capitalism in the first place? And the answer is no. Did they need to invade and genocide America? No. No, they didn't need to do that. These are conscious moral decisions, right? These are conscious moral decisions as time goes on, right? And that, as it goes on, right, he makes it like a system, and these material conditions, right, are dictating this, right? Like at any given point, they didn't know this was wrong. And he also says that the technology has nothing to do with it. Like, I mean, at historical moments, Egypt probably had the greatest technology. And see, the problem is that we pretend that white people during this period who were doing this couldn't read or something, because Aristotle existed. And even in Aristotle's times, he talks about the militaristic difference between Western Europe and like Asia, for example, right? Or Africa, right? Even to the point of saying at one point, in a proto racist type of way, that the Egyptians and Ethiopians, the black people, were more cowardly, not because they were more cowardly, probably because they weren't as militaristic as Western Europe, for example. But he also points out that Western Europe, all the being militaristic, wasn't very intelligent, because Egypt was the one advancing everybody else in terms of knowledge at that time, right? And parts of Asia, right? And he even mentions, like, Egypt probably at that time, I think he might have mentioned, was to them during their time even conceived as one of the oldest. And obviously, it was consistent throughout his work that they were black. So what did they do at this time during the time of conquest? They knew this. That's why they invented this stuff about like the Hamite, like these type of different formulations of how northern, ancient northern parts, like the Horn of Africa, or whatever you want to call it, like Egypt, Ethiopia, and all the things that these ancients were talking about, being advanced and intelligent, and black people were just a completely different like category. There was sub-Saharan African now, right? There was a completely different group of people, right, to justify the things that they were doing. Why would the heck would they need to do that? There was no if it was just all about if it was the actual conditions and the development that was creating this issue, right? And Du Bois talks about this, right? He talks about this part of the ideology, and this is a white supremacist ideology, right? So they made up these white supremacist concepts, right? And then pretended over time how it was just all economic. It's all economics, and economics developed the differences and the racial categories, which is just completely bogus. Like nobody's asking the philosophical moral questions here. These people, like I mentioned, that's why I said it's very important to understand the things I was talking about earlier, because in the video I go down their moral codes and how these moral codes ideologically affected the way they behaved, right? The cultural aspect of the different type of moral codes, right? In England versus, even in Germany and obviously in Africa was just completely different, right? So, like the way that they're justifying these things morally, when they knew they were wrong, they were utilizing these philosophical aspects. Now, that's not to say that conditions didn't affect that, right? But you can't split up the conditions and ideologies. These things go together, right? That's how you experience the world. These things together. You have like thoughts and behaviors and interaction, and that kind of works together in forming your belief systems, right? So it all goes together, and then the things that you think all this has interaction. Now you can make like a deterministic arguments, right? But at the point where you're making deterministic arguments, like to the point where of hard determinism, this kind of absent of any philosophy, what it kind of invokes the idea that you can become more intelligent, and then you can invoke free will either through knowledge or through usually through knowledge, right? You know more, therefore your experience gets filtered better, your ideological framework gets better, so your experiences, you're able to come to better conclusions and take better actions, right? But if you don't even allow that into your free will, I mean, pretty much what are you even arguing at that point, right? Because you don't have a choice what you're doing anyway, so why are you making arguments? Nobody had a choice. There was no choice about if you're going to argue the hard deterministic aspect, right? Then there was no choice, so you can't then come and make the argument now that we have to make it a choice between making class primary or race primary, because your argument is already that it's just going to develop the way it's going to develop regardless of what people thought, right? So let's look at what Du Bois had to say about this type of theory, right? I think it was Africa, or I think it was in Africa, that it came more clearly to see the close connection between race and wealth, right? This was the topic of the conversation as of right now. The fact that even in the minds of the most dogmatic supporters of race theories and believers in the inferiority of colored folk to white, there was a conscious or unconscious determination to increase their incomes by taking full advantage of this belief, right? So a conscious or unconscious, he doesn't, say which, he's just putting it up in the air, that there's a conscious or unconscious determination to increase their incomes by taking full advantage of the belief in the race theories, right? That they just kind of invented out of thin air. And then gradually this thought was metamorphosed into a realization that the income-bearing value of race prejudice was the cause and not the result of theories of race inferiority. That particularly in the United States, the income of the Cotton Kingdom based on black slavery caused the passionate belief in Negro inferiority and the determination to enforce it even by arms, right? So they just flipped it around, and eventually it become economic, but still you're using guns and you're still using force to enforce The actual things that you're trying to say was just your theory of inferiority or economics, but you're enforcing it with arms, right? So why are you still enforcing it with arms if you think that just economically it's settled, or you think that even if you thought that the belief in the race inferiority, either way, you're still going back to enforce it with arms, right? So it doesn't matter if you consider it economic or not, but in either case, I mean, you can see where that kind of argument kind of goes downhill versus the historical understanding, right? Okay. And let me go back to one of my sources from the other day. I might have to open it back up. Okay. Right. So he's talking about Bacon's Rebellion, right? As you can see, these are the laws of Virginia. This is what he's talking about in Virginia. Right. This is 1663, the one that I've pointed out. The other one was 1662. Right. So in 1662, where it has doubts have arisen whether children got by Englishmen. Okay. Now this has two significances to what he was talking about, right? First, he was talking about Bacon's Rebellion. So when is Bacon's Rebellion? And obviously the other one had to do with baptism. This is Bacon's Rebellion. This is more than a decade later. And this is the act for carrying on warfare against the barbarous Indians, right? So there were laws made during this time period, right? But the categories were already set before this, well before this. Now there were other revolts that happened before that, but it's kind of up in the air. And even this, in the sense where he mentioned that this was, I mean, no, what it had, this had to do with killing Native Americans and ridding them off the land that they were trying to take over, right? Like a dispute that basically happened around that between, and then kind of caught up in the mix. Maybe people, other individuals from particular backgrounds were armed in this revolt. This sort of had nothing whatsoever to do with. I mean that's what it had to do with, right? That was kind of the overarching theme, was the removal of Native Americans. But this is another important point to bring up here, because I mentioned the two, right? The second issue with what he said, and if you could go back, you could see that already the laws before this gave Native Americans more freedom, and it's very explicit if you read this book about the fact that during that time period they were kind of making it right, because this what says, reciting that an Indian sold for life who had no power to sell him, being of another nation, is ordered that said Indian be free, right? Right. So you can see that there's this freedom being granted to other groups of people, right? That's not granted to black people, right? Who are already at this point in time, being defined as slaves for life, right? And the very important thing that I keep going on about other stuff, but the important thing about this law specifically, right? If an Englishman, right, has a child, right, with a black woman, the child is going to be a biracial child, as we understand it today, right? But he's talking about the reasoning behind why that they were doing this was so people of different backgrounds and skin, complexions and phenotypes didn't engage against the ruling class. But yet we have it here that we have different people of different phenotypes who are still considered black and still considered slaves and still defined to this political category. This is just common sense stuff that today just kind of goes out, because not very many people grow up in areas like where I grew up, where you could see old photos, for example, of black women with white, like phenotypically white children, and then people who don't know will say, what is this, what is this black woman doing with these white babies? Is she the maid, or was she because all the old photos, was she the maid? Was she the some type of house servant or something? And they know that was the grandmother, right? That was the grandmother or the great grandmother, right? And during this time, obviously everybody knows about the story of Thomas Jefferson, what he was engaged in, but they weren't distinguished. The law stated, the precedent stated already before the Bacon Rebellion. And like I said, there was other rebellions before this, but they're kind of more sketchy as far as the historical accuracy of what actually went on. I might have to discuss that in a different video, but you could go to my website where I have a list of the different revolts, right? So with this specifically, right, it's already being codified that the phenotype has no bearing whatsoever. The only thing that has bearing on it is the status of the mother, right? And if you're enslaving at this point in time, you're enslaving, Africans. This is before the slave trade. This is as the slave trade is taking off, right? Which that's the primary thing, right? Is that during this time period, the slave trade, like people say 1619, but then you can have people who already point out the issues with the 1619 as far as the accuracy of that being, when this actually kicked off. It was more closer to the 1650. So we're talking very soon after. It was more closer to the 1650. If you read, and this is kind of why they don't want you reading Du Bois, because you just saw what I pointed out with Du Bois right there, right? Well, another thing is if you read Suppression of the Slave Trade, he talks about not only, and I mentioned this in the previous video, he talks about not only how slavery was suppressed, why it was suppressed, the various reasons, right? Because it's more nuanced. There were some people who were anti-slavery because moral Christian values or whatever they had, right? But there's other people who were anti-slavery because they understood the antithetical relationship that slaves had to the system as workers. They understood that slaves weren't going to, just show up and work and not want to, free themselves and not want to overturn the entire system, right? And there was fears about this. And and I remember there being conversations before about the Second Amendment, right? Where they had arguments because some people would argue there's a fear of slave revolts. And other people were arguing this doesn't really have anything to do with the Second Amendment, in my opinion, because I think it was more a political issue, right? It was more of a political issue than it was people actually worried about having guns or any of the other stuff, right? Because the original part of the Constitution, nobody actually thought prevented you from having guns anyway. The Bill of Rights was done afterwards, right? So, in general, the idea was that they were arguing over whether or not the slave revolts was an issue in like sentiment that white people needed to have guns because they needed to be able to shut down slave revolts, right? And one historian argued that the reasoning was flawed because this was a relatively safe society by any like historical study of areas where slave revolts taking place. How slavery was conducted in the United States actually was kind of keeping that down compared to other regions. But even with that, you have to understand that there's the psychological aspect, the unconscious aspect of knowing what you're doing to a group of people and knowing what the effects would be, what the reaction would be, right? What would be just, right? It's like before, I remember, being in school one time and saying something smart to the teacher, right? And she was behind me and I ducked. And she said, "Well, how did you know I was about to hit you in the back of the head?" Because I think she might actually tried to, like this, right? And I was like, well, because I said something offensive, obviously. So it was just like the interpersonal logic of me saying something offensive and it kind of like, the reaction that you expect out of another person, right? And if you go back and view, for example, Black Reconstruction, where they talk about at the end, this is just in any Civil War era, history, about what they were going to do with Black people. They set them free because Black people might just, get enraged and decide just to go kill all white people, right? Like they like this threat to society because they know what their actions did. They know what the moral, like kind of the just response to the actions would be, and they know how kind of in their logic what type of depravity of moral code exists, right? Of, kind of doing like anything to get back or get even or get ahead that maybe other people like aren't really thinking about, right? All the people was thinking about was freedom, was enjoying, freedom, right? They weren't thinking about, you know, let's just go kill all the white people, right? But the white people were thinking the whole entire time because they understood how antithetical was the system. But that's also the case, right? Because when black, like this is another issue, right? So when black people took over in Reconstruction, completely different result. A completely different. They took over after in Reconstruction. As if you read Black Reconstruction again, this is why I think they don't want you reading the boys a lot of the time. Because if you read Black Reconstruction, and this should be just common knowledge, the black people who took power during Reconstruction were getting a whole bunch of laws passed that were good for the people. They were good for the general population. And we're talking about people who just like first generation. They were slaves like yesterday, and then now they're passing laws for universal education. They're passing laws for benefits, and stuff like that to improve public works and the railroads. Even though there was more like ulterior motives as far as getting railroads built for industrialists. I mean, still in terms of if they would have had control, it obviously would have been also for transportation and infrastructure and stuff like that. They were getting done that we can't get done, stuff like that today in politics, right? So they were already had like an agenda of freedom that in their minds that just didn't exist elsewhere, right? Like none of the you know poor, other groups of white people or whoever else were trying to overthrow the system to get themselves universal education. So because it didn't exist, it didn't exist in the South before that. And then guess what happened? Obviously, they excluded black people from the education that they put in place, and kept all the good laws that existed during Reconstruction. They kept for white people, and excluded black people from them, even though black people were the one who put them in a place in the first place. Before that, they weren't even thinking about educating people. It is completely against it, right? So it's just stuff like this, right? And like obviously, I'll go back to that point. They were different colors of people. If you go read the other, it's like I said, this is why they don't want you reading the boys, right? We know that. See, today, like I said, this is out of people's minds because a lot of the people who were lighter skinned during these time periods are already like kind of like assimilated, and some of them are sort of just white identifying now, or so like, they just don't get very much well, some there's like famous people obviously who are obviously a lot lighter and whose ancestry goes back, right? But just look at Du Bois' introduction to Appeal to the World, right, where he describes who are the people who we're talking about, right? Let's look at this real quick. Okay. It says this group has no complete biological unity. That's what he was talking about, right? Different people from different biological backgrounds coming together, right? Black people are people from different biological backgrounds. This group has no complete biological unity, but varies in color from white to black and comprises a great variety of physical characteristics, since many are offspring of white European Americans as well as Africans and American Indians. There are a large number of white Americans who also descend from Negroes, but who are not counted in the color group nor subjected to the caste restrictions because of preponderance of white blood. That's what I just mentioned. That grew over time, right? So, yeah. So while it is in no sense absolutely set off physically from his fellow American, right? So that kind of idea, and obviously I get this, but I'm not trying to be too harsh right here. Like obviously, like I don't get what he's trying to say. I do get what he's trying to say, but I'm just saying that like kind of the ideology is just in general is kind of just off for me, right? And I'm going to edit this obviously because I kind of ranted a lot, but I just wanted to make that point, and we'll go forward from there. I'll go back and probably review the video myself if I have to add anything in. but then I'll go to the next part.
whiteness, I believe it's
People from like indigenous servitude obviously existed, right? That's not what black people were subjected to. They weren't subjected to indigenous servitude like everybody else, right? This was a completely different thing that it didn't existed, wherever else. And like I have to keep going back to the Marx quote, right? Right? Direct slavery, right? Direct slavery, and this wasn't indigenous servitude, right? This was like a completely different type of system, right? Because there were indigenous servants who were subjected to particular things, but then they got like this dramatically different treatment later on, right? I mean, and also you have to keep in mind that the category race that does not exist, right? So already you're dealing with different groups who are different groups of people. They have different backgrounds. Like Irish people have differences from even other Irish people, first of all, but then English people, and then Scottish, and then the French and the German, and even there's different groups in Germany and Switzerland, and then all these different areas have different like groups of people who consider themselves different. So the idea of white supremacy, then you have to understand, like it didn't exist in that sense, but you got to like follow your own conclusion as to it not existing. There was no one group of black people, right? They just made it up, and they made it up for the purpose of the development of these regions, right? And you could say all you want to, it's just a particular group of people. But going back to the point of this historical materialism just being complete and utter nonsense, and there not being a reason to presume that this group was going to be, I mean, you can go all the way back in history. I mean, these groups of people lived there under these conditions, going back all the way to the fall of like the Roman Empire and stuff like that. Like going all the way back. Like these feudal structures, these class structures existed. So what makes you think that this class structure was going to be different, right? The only thing that made you think that it was going to be different is the fact that they was now concentrated in cities. But like I said, that goes out of the window at a particular moment. I mean, for two, like there was two main reasons. One, there was no reason to presume that they wouldn't have been just dead okay with better conditions and not ending the system, right? It's not antithetical in that sense, right? So there's also the issue with that is already recognized, and this is the point that I want to get to about the primitive accumulation. It's already recognized that primitive accumulation isn't just something that existed as a period of time before capitalism, pre-capitalism. It's something that exists as a constant, and this is in Marx's theory, a constant thing as far as the development of capitalism in general, right? You always have to accumulate. You always have to adjust and accumulate wealth. Imperialism is an inherent part of capitalism. If you read Marx, it's just an inherent part, right? And that's the problem with Marx is that he recognized this theoretically, but his ideas, as far as his personal beliefs getting in the way of this, just kind of goes completely out. But you can see, I mean, I read this, about 5 or 6 times probably already on this. It says, without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no modern industry. This was the impetus for this existing already. This immoral, entirely unjust. Nobody in their right mind thought this was an okay thing to do, right? And then you have these people here, like who arguing against, in general, arguing against either people who want reparations because they think it's going to protect this imaginary coalition, or who are just downplaying it and trying to pretend that they support reparations, but then think that the strategies or whatever is wrong. But treating it as if it's a defense of this particular group of people who aren't even poor white people, right? So, but I mean, to eliminate slavery would just eliminate North America basically off the map, is what he's saying. But this is the point that I want to get to. All that modern nations have achieved is to disguise slavery at home. And that's what he meant by wage labor, disguise slavery at home. But think about this even more, right? Do we still have migrant workers here? Do we still have sex trafficking? Do we still have human trafficking in the United States? Is there places in the United States you can go where wage theft exists, where people aren't getting paid, they're getting paid under the table, they're not getting paid what they're supposed to be getting paid? they're doing work, but they're not getting paid for it at all, right? Yes, this exists right now in the United States. Still, with the prison, people try to mention the prison system all the time, and in certain instances, this is probably a good thing to point to. Yes, they're still doing exactly what he's describing here of the primitive, accumulation, right? And they still export the slavery to other countries, right? They export the capital to other countries. They deindustrialize, right? These are all elements of capital that are kind of from the offset recognizable. These are just the way capitalism functions. It's not a particular period of time that was primitive accumulation and then we get to something. No, slavery never entered the United States. The first chapter after the Boys does in Black Reconstruction is called Back to Slavery, right? And there's a whole book says like slavery by another name and stuff like that, right? Dedicated to this, right? I mean, it's just, come on, but I have to move on at this point because I'm almost doing going on an hour or something like that. I haven't even gotten past like the this part, but that might be as far as I want to go with this one. But I'll see what else comes up.
The title discusses how whiteness is created as a means to deny the capacity of poor and working class people from various different racial backgrounds, or there's only one race, it's a human race, various physical descriptions being able to come together and unite and come together and challenge the lords of capital. And I think
there was absolutely nothing in history that you could say was preventing this. At any given point, when Black people were protesting, at any given period of time, where they were subjected to race riots, there's other people. And also, I got to bring this up real quick too. Is when we talk about race riots or pogroms or whatever you want to call them, where Black people were just getting massacred, that's basically what happened. Black people were just getting massacred, but a lot of times they just call them race riots. Like white people got mad and they started massacring Black people, right? So you have to keep in mind that the stuff like this was happening. Like there was a series of where Italians were getting lynched. Like he mentions, right, but he just kind of it's a contradictory. Okay, we're going to admit this, but then we're not going to really pay attention to what's going on here. There were these other groups of people that were subjected to these types of the behaviors against each other, right? So yeah, but against each other, at any given point, they could have been like, let's go after the ruling class. Like what the like who's the responsibility on here, right? The ruling class has like so much like what are we talking about, the magical the voodoo stuff? If you're talking about white supremacy, can't be like this like abstracting category, but then what kind of abstracting like kind of mind control manipulation does the government have where you can't realize that a German person shouldn't be fighting an Irish immigrant over who's going to get the jobs, and they shouldn't just be slaughtering Black people because Black people might somehow get in the way of them having a larger chunk of the pie. You have to understand that after all these years where these Europeans have been doing this type of systems, where the people at the bottom are fighting in wars, world wars, and all this other type of stuff to maintain these systems, that they have an adherence to these systems, because there's nothing already to assume that they're antithetical, but there's a whole slew of evidence to assume that they're not, right? Because even when Black people fought in the war, they understood the contradiction. Like someone posted on because of this recent activity with these Black police officers, right? Someone said if you're in the military or the police and you're Black, there's probably something sort of wrong with you, right? Whatever that is, you want to say like internalize anti-Blackness, white supremacy, because everybody's subjected to the same ideological construct that exists throughout society, right? So like just the idea like that this Black police officers in certain instances is already kind of like a ooh type thing. It's already like the contradiction automatically is understood. But if there's a white police officers, it's just like you understand what it is. And all these groups that were subjected to all these things at any given point could have been like the Irish, and when they were being made into police chiefs and stuff like that, could have just been like, hey, we were subject to this police violence. We don't want to engage in this against other groups of people. But these like these moral questions, is just right. I mean, I don't know, right? It's just the black people that have to take responsibility, right? It's the elite middle class, you know, the one or two black people that do it in like particular, industries where they're not even in power of their own careers, let alone like any type of meaningful, capital or anything like that. That they have to take accountability, right? It's the black Democrats that, you know, basically show up, probably being blackmailed or whatever else, to do whatever that they're doing, who have to bear the responsibility, but no working class person has to bear the responsibility for hundreds of years of 500 years of not being class conscious, right?
I think that part of the problem we have with using frameworks like quote unquote white supremacists, the invention of the white race, thank you, using frameworks like white supremacy is that we make it seem like this is some kind of overarching collective conspiracy in which every single white citizen in the world is participating and every single black and brown citizen is being disadvantaged, when anyone who makes a cursory understanding and analysis of capitalism can tell you is that white people are being savaged from capitalism all over the world, even in the United States.
And they're getting benefits from capitalism all over the world too, even in the United States.
Even in Europe, and they have been for years. One of the things that motivated Marx was not only understanding.
Look, I mean, yeah, there are groups of people getting some negative, but also who've gotten tons of benefits from colonialism, from imperialism, right? I mean, if you just think of the last few years of what's happening in, say Yemen or like Syria, now we got Ukraine. Um, I mean, the stuff that's happening during COVID. I mean, is AFRICOM. If you got, I mean, till you take any of the imperialist projects over the last, Iraq, Afghanistan, um, you know, stuff that was going on in South America, right? The coups and all this other stuff. If you take any of these like collective, imperialist projects, at any given point, the white population could just get upset and say, "Hey, we can't keep killing all these people. Let's just shut down our government and then, install a new government that doesn't engage in this imperialism." I mean, at any given point, right? At any given point, they could just break white supremacy. That's why I showed this the other day, right? Or I didn't. I might not have shown this one. So let me show this one now. It's one of these. There we go. Because this comes up, right? You see this right here? The idea that black people are a minority? Barely. There's barely more Germans in the United States than there are black people. And we're higher than Mexicans. Right? So at any given point, these people could just say, "Hey, whiteness, we're not for that anymore. We're not going to, in unison, vote for the Democratic and Republican parties, or we're not in unison going to support the Democratic parties, regardless of them not helping black people and supporting racist policies, like 90% of their policies. We're going to just keep voting for Republicans. We're going to keep voting for Democrats. We're going to keep being anti-black." I mean, at any given point in time, these people could just break up into these small units of races, just eliminate racism. Now, all of a sudden, look who's in the majority. You got black people and Mexicans vote together. They're a huge chunk of the population. But in unison, you have these same groups forming in this minority hold. I mean, when do they have to question their ideological framework, right? They're just all, victims of not being class conscious. Right? That's why I said it's the total lack of class analysis, but there's a total lack of race analysis too. Black people is constantly held as the minority. They're not a minority group if you don't include racism. If you don't include white supremacy, they're not a minority group. Right? You might say Asians are a minority group, right? Because where's Chinese on this list? Right here, 1%, almost I mean, round it off to 1%. They're not even 1.5, right? Indian, 1%. So if you count up Indian and Chinese, you're not even at 3%. You understand? So, I mean, like, at what point in time did, like I said, I keep saying this. I'll say this a million times. At what point in time is it their responsibility to just put it into the system? And this is the video that I wanted to show. He doesn't get into this. Well, I mean, this is sort of the argument, but this is pretty much it, right? And this is a conservative dude who always says stuff that's completely bogus and completely wrong. But he makes points against liberals and people who fall into these liberal-esque categories like bourgeois, socialism, right? They're just, one's focusing on class, and the other one's focusing on, identity politics, anti-racism type, performative, one's performing these identities, one's performing these this fake class, relationship, right? Like I mentioned yesterday. But watch this for a second.
Because you're the one who said, I'm the beneficiary of illicit privilege. So you're a really good starting point, because I'm asking, if you're in possession of stolen goods, why aren't you willing to return them? So that's why fundamentally I see your charity. During the Civil War, there was a guy who goes, I'm very happy to give, I've given 3 cousins to the war, and I'm ready to sacrifice my wife's brother. That's basically your ethics. You're willing to have social justice if other people pay, but you're not willing to pay. So that's the problem. And that's the problem with the progressivism that marches behind social justice while protecting its own privileges. You know how you said, we all have to survive. Really? You have to be at Amherst to survive? You don't have to be at Amherst to survive. You have to be at Amherst to benefit. You have to be at Amherst because you're getting opportunities at this college that many other people are not getting. So if you say you believe in equal opportunity, you're a hypocrite, because you are taking advantage of opportunities unavailable to others. But for you, this hypocrisy is fully justified because you are militating on behalf of the poor. But if you are against privilege, this college is privilege.
Right. I mean, that's pretty much just sums up the entire issue with these type of arguments, right? Okay. So let's move on.
Understanding the mechanisms of primitive accumulation and understanding how black and brown people were used in the period of primitive accumulation to aggrandize wealth for these European empires and these nation states.
Like I said, there's no period of a primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is a feature, is an inherent feature of capitalism, right? It's just, you have to understand that Marx kind of makes simplifications in its theory so people can understand it from just the capitalist social relation, right? But just because capitalism becomes this sort of dominant relation, not only doesn't mean that these other relations have to disappear, like slavery and feudal type of relations, right? Those relationships are inherently tied to the system. Like you have to do that. If you don't, I mean, like if you think that the CIA is just trafficking drugs and people because it's fun, right? Or trafficking the drugs, or doing the blackmail, overthrowing foreign governments, installing, doing this economic warfare, and these huge, IMF loans going out, and taking over the control of all these resources here and there and everywhere, giving these massive bailout packages that are basically theft of tax funds, and printing money out of thin air just to give to banks to keep them afloat after these financial crashes, or having to come out every other year and basically inject people. I mean, this was the COVID vaccine Operation Warp Speed, and giving these vaccines to people is a crime. It's an international crime. It's not capitalism. It's a crime. You understand? It's not capital, it's a crime, right? So Marx differentiates that so people can understand that capitalism, even if it existed perfectly, is flawed. It doesn't work. It's completely corrupt. On its surface, just looking at wage labor and capital. But that's not how it functions in reality, because if it doesn't function in reality, how do you fill that void to get it to actually work? Well, that you fill that void to get it to actually work is when the economy is going completely dry, and these pharmaceutical companies are like, hey, we need help. Okay, provide this vaccine for this virus that they're spreading around, and then you're going to get billions of dollars in revenues and money to pay for this vaccine technology that's not even viable. That's going to kill, however many people. We don't care. We just don't care. They don't care. They don't care if it kills people or not. Like, you could get it and be completely okay. You can get it and then develop, like long COVID or get blood clots and die. They don't care. They don't care either way. It's just about, they got to fill these voids and making them money, right? Because capitalism doesn't work. But if you don't understand the functioning of capitalism, and you understand primitive accumulation as this period that happened back in the day, but you don't understand it as an ongoing thing, you don't understand that you need these groups of people even after, like, they couldn't get rid of slavery, right? During the Civil War, like when Marx was arguing about the working day, like I said, when that's an indication already that there's this idea that, it's not about the moral issue with slavery. It's not about the slaves being free, but in the back of your head, unconsciously, right? The unconscious speaks, right, through the actions, right? Like the Freudian slip. You let it slip up right there that you're potentially more worried about Europeans getting higher wages than you were worried about the blacks being enslaved in the first place, right? You're worried about the benefits that are going to come to European workers more than you're worried about the fact that these people was enslaved, right? So you develop your whole concept of primitive accumulation. It got people to this day that don't understand that primitive accumulation is even, just an inherent feature because of the way they're talking about as a period of time. Like, there's this period of time called primitive accumulation. It wasn't. During that period of time, primitive accumulation took place, but primitive accumulation always takes place. And it shouldn't even be called primitive accumulation because it's just capitalist accumulation. That's how capitalism just works. It has to work that way without that simplification, right? Like I just said. Otherwise, it's going to completely collapse. It has to utilize state power to bail out, corporations to provide, either welfare or police violence in order to prevent, these lower levels of groups of people, usually black people, right? Usually always black people at the bottom. Right, or whatever group exists, in other countries who happen to make their way and have to occupy a bottom, tier of that particular country. Right, it just has to operate that way. It can't operate any other way.
But also realizing that the quote-unquote notion of free labor in the industrial European West was a brutal system that was disadvantaging whites just as badly as other people who were being used as fodder for capitalism as well.
And this is another point to make about Marx, right? Because he talks about how you have this industrialized brutality that's happening during the development of capital as a dominant relation, right? Not even during during the capitalist accumulation process, right? Like to European workers during industrialization, right? But this according to him, is bringing it together for, a revolutionary moment, right? But if you think about, if Marx wasn't pushing so hard for industrialization and capitalism, he was pushing for capitalism, right? Because everybody who wanted to keep what they had in Germany, he was calling reactionaries and a whole bunch of other names, right? They didn't understand this, they didn't understand that. But at that point in time, the Berlin Conference didn't even happen to the end of Marx's life. Africa wasn't even completely colonized yet, right? There was still so much more other stuff that could happen. And then after that, you get World War I and World War II, and then where we're at today, right? But even at that point, like Russia industrialized, China industrialized, and during this forced industrialization process, when they say, communism killed, all these people during these periods, right? I mean, that's kind of, completely bogus. That's just, it's completely stuff that they made up. But during these periods of industrialization, it is rough. And they did put that on their system, and they did mess up. I mean, during these periods with policies, right? This isn't a critique against them. It's not like I say I could have did it better. It's not like saying anybody else could have did it better. But when you put industrialization to the forefront, it's capitalist industrialization that had to happen to compete even with capitalists to even control power in your own country, right? Because if Russia went industrialized, someone would have invaded them and industrialized for them, probably at a certain point. And that's a point that sometimes Marx doesn't even get across. That capitalism, he does, but sometimes it's lost in some of these conversations. Is that capitalism is almost like a cancer, but it's not like he didn't contribute to that cancer, right? Because it was growing at this point in time. It wasn't completely, right. We don't know how history would have been different if, Germany would have taken different directions at certain points, or if, other countries would have taken, certain different, paths in terms of socialism, in terms of libertarianism, in terms of anarchism. A lot of the stuff that he argued against, right? So, capitalism was, according to Marx, this, something that was bringing in wonders of technology and all this other stuff greater than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, according to him, greater than, anything in the ancient world. So, it's just that type of ideological framework that exists is kind of warped too. I just want to point that out.
The point of today's Mile Hour is to make the argument that oftentimes when we look at phenomenon that are disadvantaging Black or brown communities, we oftentimes normalize the assumption that white supremacy is the cause. And it's white. See, that gentrification is because of white supremacy. It's because of white supremacy that all those Black folk have some subpar housing. Mass incarceration is definitely because of white supremacy. What we fail to realize is that capitalism is vicious enough that it does not need to be mystified to cause the harm that it does. And one of the realities that we have to understand about capitalism is that capitalism, because it requires an otherized, reserve, or surplus labor quotient that will be left to be discarded, those people are most likely going to be racialized in a way.
Okay. The groups were already racialized. So Jews didn't exist during that period. Italians didn't exist. Irish didn't exist. All these groups were racialized. Racism has nothing to do with it. All the groups were already racialized. What they did was develop a new version of racism where the white races were privileged over the rest, over the Black. And this is something to think about, right? This was conscious. Remember, I showed you this. I already showed you that source, right? Or from my website, right? Of Du Bois talking about this, where he says that. Let me see what part of the website is it. Okay, this should be one of the articles. So here we go. What's the statistics? It was probably the statistics, right? You could already see that, besides this very brief period where they thought that Black people could be Christians, there was an idea that when slave trade was stopped, the Negroes would die out. Well, why did they want to stop the slave trade to have them die out? If it didn't have anything to do with, if they needed the otherized group, then why were they worried about them dying out? Okay, they understood, like I mentioned in the previous videos, white supremacy understood the entire time of not keeping Black people around. Like, the only group of people that wanted to keep Black people around were the losers of the Civil War, the Confederates. Were destined to the Democrats. Remember, I posted on a video. You'll see the flash Democrats across the street because that's still the Democratic Party strategy. The Democratic Party strategy has always been, and this will come up, it has always been the one of either, like I said in the last part of the video, either we'll kill you, or if you don't vote for us, or we'll have the Republicans now kill you, or, good cop, bad cop. It's just completely, and the genocide of, you know, black people, right? Like, they don't need this. They didn't need black people to be the other group, basically. But that, I mean, that has to be like the fact that they didn't. It didn't necessarily have to be black people. If they need another group, they could have picked. They could have just picked poor people. They could have developed their own system of dividing people up. Right? Like, capitalism doesn't need an otherized group in terms of a race by itself, right? But capitalism didn't develop out of that. It developed out of colonialism and slavery. That's the point. Marx points this out. It didn't develop out of an other group. It developed out of colonialism and slavery. And they understood from the beginning that the victims of colonialism and slavery were the antithetical feature within the system that could lead to their own demise, which is why they were trying to suppress the slave trade. It's why they were bringing in all these white workers. Black people at the end of the Civil War were starting to become more intelligent. They were the groups of people who actually wanted to learn. At the end of the Civil War, they were the strongest and most capable as far as laborers, physical laborers. That's what they're doing for hundreds of years. So, and what kind of like crazy mindset would these not be the workers that you take as workers if that's the goal of capitalism? Because it wasn't a goal of capitalism, it was the white supremacy. You don't take the best workers. You took the workers that you felt was going to conform with your system the best. And that's why you get all these immigrants going to these cities and fighting amongst each other for who's going to get these jobs, and, all fighting against black people. I mean, some of them came and were anarchists, right? Some of them came and were communists. They brought communism and stuff with them, right? But we know the inherent flaws, like the inherent flaws with the labor movement in general, when you still got these people fighting for these labor movements and stuff like that. The point of a labor movement is for labor, to get better jobs, to get more benefits of capitalism. If your entire goal and purpose is to get benefits of capitalism, it's not going to overthrow the system. If you're trying to put your time and effort into frameworks of organizations and institutions whose primary objective is to get better wages, you're going to get what you got during the New Deal, which was all these groups fighting to get benefits and just a New Deal. And then after that, they dismantled everything. Once they got rid of the issue, they just dismantled the rest of the thing. And then this was all for white folks, right? By this time, black people had been free free in terms of slavery ending for a while. So you would expect during this time period, if there wasn't this other thing going on, that they would have just been perfectly fine. And it wasn't because they were a minority of the population. They were not a minority of the population. All these other groups of people who were different minority groups. Let me go show my thing again. Right? If I could find it. There. All these other groups of people who were part of different minority groups all teamed up against this group of people who are called black people. Why? Because there were legal and structural frameworks that go all the way back to the 1600s where this was defined within the system by a particular set of people for this purpose, right? And the same people recognize that, heck, at this point, we got to get rid of it. We can't have these group of people hanging around in the system. Black people just survive this stuff. I mean, if they could eliminate black people magically, they probably would have done it by now, right? I mean, there's this idea that, yes, you need black people to give this type of other, I mean, that idea does kind of exist, right? Because if you didn't have black people, it would be kind of rough in certain instances. But I mean, it's not a reserve labor army. When they brought in the reserve labor army, there was all these white people they were bringing in to work in these factories as soon as industrialization hit the United States, right? As soon as industrialization hit the United States, they brought in all these people to work in the northern factories. Right, that's why you got all these high amount of Germans in New York and Jewish people in New York, and then you got German immigrants and stuff around Ohio and these industrial belts around the United States. Right, that's how you have that more Germans than you have English people during this period of immigration. You can see right here, right? It's Irish, Italian, right? All these different groups coming, right? I mean, it's just common sense, basically, what was going on. So I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? So even if you want to say that, yeah, they need an otherized group, it didn't have to be black people. That's the main point. Even if you want to say that, and obviously the system understood that if it was going to be this reserve labor army, if there was going to be laborers, then it wasn't going to be black people. Even though they're the best qualified to actually to be in any type of class or be a part of society, right?
That basically ensures that the worst harms of that society, whether it be poor quality of food, poor quality of housing, poor quality of education, whether it's going to be mass incarceration or otherwise, is going to be leveraged onto them because the majority of people cannot be made to feel that they are disproportionately relegated to that surplus, even though they largely are. For example, there are more people in America that are poor, that are white, than black. That's a fact. And unfortunately,
I already showed you the chart. There are white poverty and black poverty as it exists are just two fundamentally completely things. There's an entire difference between getting social benefits. I mean, at least since the New Deal, right? Versus having the social benefits completely cut when you needed them, right? There's a difference between living in these rural areas with low versus living in a lot of these urban areas concentrated with high amounts, right? I mean, just in terms of like clean air, for example, right? I mean, this didn't happen. Black people are from rural areas. Why did they go into the north from these rural areas, for example? Huh? I mean, think about that, for example. Because they were trying to escape slavery in the South, even after slavery. That's what the black codes were about. Keeping them enslaved in the South. After slavery was already supposed to officially end. And you had the lynchings. And you had, just them being completely destroyed. The coups, the counter-revolution, of them being kicked out of government offices. So eventually there's like, forget this, let's and large number leave the South. And go to these other places where hopefully there's some opportunity. And that started from the end of the Civil War as far as they could escape. And then finally, when they was able to escape more going into the 20th century, right? And then they go into these cities and then they've already brought in all these immigrants for all these jobs, right? Because they didn't want black people working them jobs. It wasn't because they needed another group. It was because they didn't like black people. And they knew they unconsciously even knew what was going on.
Actually, one of the sad realities of the way in which capitalism works in this country is that in the consciousness
Okay, back to this. It shouldn't be much longer.
of most Americans, the only people who suffer from poverty in America are black and brown people, when in reality, the majority of the people who are suffering are white. They're not black and brown. This is a perfect example of how the racialization of the harms of capital denies in the consciousness of the white proletarian and often even lumpen proletarian that capitalism necessitates their carnage as well. It just so happens that disproportionately the carnage affects the black and brown people at a higher rate when the overall number of the carnage affects them. A perfect example of this how this happens in France. In a city like
I don't think that poor white people have any problem understanding any of this. The problem with poor white people, they're scattered across the United States, first of all, right? It's like the entire United States, right? There's white people everywhere. There's white people in all these rural areas that they've never seen, any type of like meaningful diversity, right? Like, man, there's where I'm from, and like in Appalachia, like throughout, there's schools probably where they might have had one or two black people in that entire school growing up, like that. People that I know personally went to school in schools where they were the only black person, or like them and one other cousin or something, right? So, I mean, like they're just scattered across the United States in small areas, like rural areas where there's like the total populations aren't very high, right? So there's not the industrial capitalist issue where, like I said, there's not the rich Carnegie or Rockefeller living on top of the hill with the poor, proletarians at the bottom of the hill. There's this, I mean, they're rural, they're spread out. I mean, they, if they get, I mean, if they're poor, they're just poor. I mean, they don't like. There's nothing to really like articulate from, and they can accept the framework of capitalism, right? That's the point. If you accept the framework of capitalism, you can understand. And if you're not going to do any of that work to dissect the ideological framework, right? As far as the individualist framework that exists in people's minds of these people have this and this because they're more intelligent, because they work harder, because they have aspirations to do it, that you'll one day have this if you start your own business, or if you work hard enough for this company, like that you should think beyond just getting a good job, and or just I mean, this is just totally ignoring the aspect of people who are in these positions because drug use, or because they are their own decisions, right? So you now have to get in the psychological thing to explain how even the things that you've done wrong in your life might not completely be a matter of your bad decisions, when while also are having to recognize the fact that it probably did have something to do with their bad decisions, right? So I mean, even that scenario, right? Not every white person who's poor in the United States is like this benevolent human beings that were just harmed by capitalism. Just this is the same as is true for every black person, right? So you have the issue of being spread out. You have the issue they don't necessarily have to remain poor necessarily. There's a lot of generational poverty, but there's a lot of people who end up, getting, steady jobs, and that's cool for them, right? They get that good job, that happens to be, one of the last Mohican, union jobs, as I heard a worker describe before one of the news channels. Is what he said. We're basically the last, out here, as far as I think it was in Detroit, where they had a union job, maybe with the like one of the motor type companies. But you have to just keep that type of stuff in mind, like the scattered out, the different different like lifestyles and frameworks, and the different ideological views. I mean, all that stuff has to be taken into account, right? And then on top of that, it has to be taken into account the rest of the white folks, right? So think about all of the white people who are not poor, right? They make up the larger majorities of people generally, right? So you're even assuming that these poor white folks, for example, the people I grew up with, don't have this class consciousness, right? Maybe they do. You ever think of that? Maybe they do. Maybe lots of them do. But maybe just because they're so far spread out, and maybe because they're in concentrations, around other black people or around other poor people of different minority groups, they identify with those minority groups, just like every other minority identifies with other minority groups, right? Like, like in New York, for example, you have, Puerto Ricans who obviously identify, with hip hop, or like poor Jewish kids who identified, with hip hop growing up, right? You know what I mean? And then regardless of whether or not they culturally adopt certain other views, right, is kind of, a different story. But there are, people who are impoverished who do operate within that type of construct where they understand how the system affects them, right? So the idea that solidarity didn't exist, that doesn't exist amongst poor people, amongst like working class people, is just absolutely bogus in and of itself. Like there is a recognition of it. It's just the fact that not all the white people who are poor are, you know, in these areas, and not all the white people who are poor are or not all the white people in general are poor. I mean, it's just a basic demographic type issue. This resolved if you just look up the demographics or you just have like any experience of life whatsoever.
Paris, you have 10% of the population of Paris is Muslim. All right, that means Middle Eastern, Arab, Algerian, North African, West African. Metropolitan Paris is made up of Muslim, or an N-wordization process to the same kind of otherization tactics in French or Parisian capitalism that otherizes Black people in American capitalism. So what I'm trying to convey to you,
capitalism is a global system. I mean, that's just a basic point. Capitalism is a global. I mean, saying American capitalism. I mean, there would be like America is an English colony, like Marx said. That the entire, I mean, as much as England wouldn't be able to industrialize without cotton, without English, you know, money for the cotton, there wouldn't have been this initial money within the United States, or cotton or tobacco, or whatever they originally started with, right? So, I mean, there wouldn't have been this trade route and these relationships going on, right? Which was he mentioned earlier, but now it's trying to get it back into like how it's just, you know, American versus French, like within these like, you know, these specific frameworks when I guess it's convenient, which I guess is okay in certain instances. I don't think this is one of them.
is that this form of otherization is a function of capitalism's need to keep in the consciousness of the minds of the majority of the people that they are not the ones who are facing harm. And the main reason that this has to be done is because if it became consciousness in the conscious in
Right, this is the class consciousness myth. I would explain why that was wrong.
the minds of the majority of white people that they are adversely being affected by capitalism, just like Black people. And if they became conscious that it was being done to the same rate or in the same way.
See, this is the issue. This is the issue because, like, who is the audience for this, and who are these people? Because every time I see people make these type of arguments, it's to a particular type of white people who are also like college educated and middle class. So you're telling like the college educated and middle class professional managerial class that you're associating with that they need class consciousness? Because I mean, I don't know how many poor people, white people, are watching this, but I mean, I doubt it's many to hear that. So who is your target audience? Who are you telling?
They would rebel because they are not socialized to accept the fact that they are the N-word of American society.
I mean, I already explained this. Irish people knew what they were in relation to English people. Scottish people knew what they were in relation to English people. Italian people knew what they were in relation to English people. German people knew what they were in relation to English people. When they came to the United States, they knew this. They just decided to throw that out the back window. They just throw that out the window. Right? They just have that moral responsibility. Just threw it out the window. They didn't care. They didn't care. Like you can watch all the videos you want of people saying, "Oh man, I didn't know that, you know, my ancestor did this and this and this," when they review their genealogy. Like we just didn't talk about it. I didn't know that there was these, you know, I saw one where I didn't know that there were these, you know, these racial like housing, you know, covenants and stuff like that that benefited, you know, my family. But, I mean, like, oh my goodness. Like they were aware of this. They were moving to America for opportunities like immigrants are today. They know what's going on. They're not stupid. Like people know American history. They like you have to choose, you have to consciously choose to believe these myths at a certain level. Right? Because anybody could do research, anybody could read, anybody could go, like what is preventing you from asking like just basic questions about reality. It's your ideological disposition and your class position, but that doesn't exist for poor people. So like I said, who's the target audience?
While unfortunately capitalism renders that socialization to black and brown communities to believe that. And I think that one of the jobs that we try to do at This Is Revolution podcast is to collapse the notion that capitalism is something that exclusively affects people of XYZ color, while at the same time not being blind to the fact that there are particular ways that certain communities of color are disproportionately laid with the harm. That doesn't deny that white and poor working class communities aren't facing a form of mass incarceration, aren't facing social harms.
Again, like who is your target audience? Like, you think that poor white people are unaware that they're poor white people go to prison? You think they're unaware that the mass incarceration affects them? Do you think they're unaware that obviously black people have like what? Like, you think if the black people come and stress their issues, like slavery and stuff like that, that these poor people in prison and stuff like that's going to like not aware of the issues or something? Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, to me, this seems as a way to tell white audiences who are predominantly college educated, who are predominantly middle class or adjacent to it, that we don't really need to worry about that race issue that much, that we're sort of this 99% group together, and to use that class to obscure, just as they're claiming the race is obscuring the class issue, right? Because they're obscuring the class issue too. Because like I mentioned, this, where is the class analysis in this? Like, what statistics are you using to show, or what experiences or like case studies are you using to show how white poverty operates, or how their ideology operates, or I mean, like, how this has any connection to consciousness or class consciousness or the system, or how what or how what, like, because even saying that there are certain things like done to black people in the system, like just minimizing it to that, for real. I mean, that's offensive in and of itself if you really think about what we know happens to black people versus the minimalization of, oh well, yeah, there are things, there are just these things that happen that we recognize that those things happen. I mean, come on.
Aren't facing job loss, but it also demonstrates that brown communities, because of the overall way over time that these vicissitudes have been weighed with those harms, have accumulated a certain type of carnage amongst themselves that basically is material in its consequence. So my position is not to deny that there is not a way in which the racialized accumulation of benefits and resources to quote unquote white people gives them a certain racial advantage in some ways and sometimes. My goal is to say that we need to demystify this notion of relegating everything to quote unquote simply white supremacy, and realizing that oftentimes many of the carnages that black and brown communities,
Capitalism is the political economic arm of white supremacy.
are facing are actually much more in tune with the way in which capitalism, particularly in its more recent iteration, which we call neoliberalism, which I would argue is
See, the most we have to go through all these iterations to justify how we went through all these other iterations, and nothing happened in terms of this proletariat, even when they were significantly poor. I'm talking about white proletariat, even when there was one. That was significantly poor and like basically forced this other labor power. But now we got this neoliberalism, and now we have to explain how the abstraction of that fantasy class that sort of might not even exist. I don't know. I mean, someone just had to show where it exists. But to basically college educated and privileged whites.
really just a hyper form of free marketism or privatization, if you will, if we realize that in this current iteration of capitalism that we've seen in the last 50 years, it's even more ruthless, it's even more brutal, it's even more cutthroat, then we'll understand why it becomes easy for us to take some of the phenomenon that are particularly affecting urban black and brown communities and simply waylay it down to, oh, it's white supremacy. That's why that mass incarceration is happening. Not to mention that, well, there's been deindustrialization in these communities that have been feeding urban crime for over 50 years. Maybe that's a correlation to why mass incarceration is happening instead of a simple conspiracy theory that's like, oh, it's the mystical, magical white supremacy. So I think that we should.
I mean, I guess the Gary Webb, the Iran Contra stuff was all just conspiracy nonsense. COINTELPRO, Operation Chaos, all the operations that we don't. I mean, I don't know all the names of all the operations, but all the federal government, local police, FBI, CIA, Secret Service. I mean, mob ties, other countries, operations that existed of drug trafficking, of sex trafficking, of pretty much anything that you could think of. We can't. Yeah, it did affect poor white people too. Yeah, definitely, 100% did. But it was targeted predominantly at black communities, right? The assassinations, the rest was targeted specifically at destroying black communities, right? So I mean, I don't know what kind of like what constitutes a conspiracy when they come out and straight up say that this is what's happening, this is what we're doing, this is what we're targeting. I mean, I don't know.
Be a little bit more nuanced in understanding the way in which mechanism and institutions within the hierarchies of capital are affecting communities that are disproportionately facing the brunt of those systems. And I think it also makes it more effective in our ability to challenge the workings of capitalist systems, to use that type of more sophisticated and nuanced language in thinking and challenging those hierarchies, as opposed to simply laying everything down to a kind of cross band broad quote unquote white supremacy is a problem. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of what I'm trying to get to with the.
I guess very very simply would be you could have done that then. Very simple.